Hey, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Kakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. All learned this truth from the rule well. Peace and salutations to the 144,000 and the rest of the 1/3, the large multitude. Until y'all say shalom. Come to you back with another lesson through the Spirit. Now I'm entitled this one, This Truth Looks Foolish to the People of the World. Because ultimately, when we're out there on the highways and byways, or putting up these lessons on a YouTube or whatever social media sites or on the internet, people pretty much brush it off like it's not important. Especially the nation of Israel, 2/3 of the nation of Israel. They're comprised of the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native American Israelite foreigners that may look like the heathen, but ultimately their lineage goes back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, these are the main ones who come up against this truth. You know, especially out there on the highways and byways. You know, the main scoffers, mockers, and naysayers are the nation of Israel. You know, because you'll have heathens come up to the camp. You know, they'll look at the sign and, you know, ask where is their tribe from, you know, especially the self-proclaimed white people, you know, the Edomites. And, you know, we'll try out the spirit, you know, read their spirit, see if, you know, they could be a Israelite foreigner. You know, they may look like a so-called white man or a so-called white woman, you know, but ultimately their lineage goes back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, he got examples in the rap industry, you know, like Eminem, you know, Justin Timberlake. You know, those are all examples of Israelites. They may look like so-called white people, but ultimately you can tell that their lineage goes back to Jacob, because, you know, Jake, the nation of Israel, Yahweh, they're the salt of the earth. You know, they're very talented, got every single talent in the world that you could think of, because Jacob is the beginner of all things, you know. So that's why Jacob, you know, the nation of Israel, they can make everything, you know, add that swag to it, you know. But these heathens, you know, they can't do that. That's why ultimately when you tell them that, you know, they're the heathen, then they'll start coming against the truth, you know, because they want the inheritance, they want the salvation. They pretty much want what the nation of Israel is going to be given unto them, you know, as a promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you know, to the descendants of the 12 tribes. You know, but only the nation of Israel is going to get the kingdom of heaven, not these other heathen nations and these self-proclaimed white people. They want to somehow make themselves, you know, fit into the you know, the second covenant. You know, ultimately it was only given unto the nation of Israel. But right now, you know, the preaching out there on the highways and byways, you know, it looks foolish to these people. You know, they'll scoff and mock, you know, especially our people, telling us that these different prophecies aren't going to come to pass. You know, but ultimately because the truth wasn't given unto them, it wasn't given unto the so-called wise of this world. You know, people that went to theological school or cemetery school, as we call it. You know, they went to college and these different universities that are esteemed very highly in this society. You know, people look at those type of people as wise, but ultimately all that knowledge, you know, that they've so-called knowledge that they've learned, you know, in these colleges, universities, you know, it's foolish, because ultimately that doesn't pertain to salvation. That all that so-called knowledge that they went to school for X amount of years, you know, it's not going to be able to deliver them when all hell breaks loose. You know, the only thing that's going to be able to deliver you and have you covered is if you have that personal relationship with Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai, being part of that elect. You know, the rest of all this folly, all this so-called knowledge that these people claim themselves to know, you know, they claim themselves to be very wise, you know, it's a stumbling block. You know, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai put that illusion on them that makes them think that, you know, they know a lot, you know, that they got all the so-called higher knowledge of the world, but ultimately they don't, because they don't have the true knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. They don't know Yahweh Bashem Yahushua. They don't know the fear of the Lord. This is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 5 and verse 1. Then shall the righteous man stand in great boldness before the face of such as have afflicted him, and made no account of his labors. And the righteous man is going to be the elect of the nation of Israel in these days. Standing in the face of those who afflicted him. The self-proclaimed white people, the Edomites, Esau, the different heathen nations, and even our own people. They put hell on the hopeful elect. Constantly harassing us. Scoffing and mocking on the highways and byways and the videos. These damn heathens taking no account for all the labors, all the creations, all the inventions that the nation of Israel has done. Took in all these different inventions from the nation of Israel and put a patent on it and claimed them as themselves. Because ultimately Esau, Edom, these self-proclaimed white people and these damn heathens, they really haven't created anything. They really haven't invented anything. Because ultimately that gift was given unto the nation of Israel. That's why we're out there on the highways and byways, proclaiming our true heritage, telling the heathen nations that they're going to go into slavery. And they don't like that. Verse 2, when they see it, they shall be troubled with terrible fear and shall be amazed at the strangeness of his salvation, so far beyond all that they look for. That's why these wicked elite, and these heathens, these Edomites, these Elamites, whatever heathen nation that might walk by the camp, they're really in fear. That's why a lot of times they don't even want to walk by the camp, ultimately because they know that it condemns them as a nation, because all these different nations are going to be subject under the nation of Israel. They're going to help build the kingdom up, but the wicked elite, they're going to be the first fruits of slavery. That's why they're going to be preserved in those bunkers, eventually to be pulled out and be the first fruits of slavery. And that's why when the elect get beamed up, us to the hopeful elect, Lord willing, we endure to the end, and we be a part of that number. They're gonna look at the salvation by the way of the chariots that they ignorantly call UFOs that are gonna be beaming up the elect, out of America from the upcoming destruction that's gonna take place by the way of the missiles. And throughout the four corners of the earth, wherever the elect may be scattered, the people are going to be just looking up and, be like, damn, those are the children, the sons of Yahweh Bashem Yahushua, the daughters of Yahweh Bashem Yahushua, the true Israelites. Verse 3, and they repenting and groaning for anguish of spirit shall say within themselves, this was he whom we had sometimes in derision, and a proverb and a reproach. That's right. The 2/3 of the nation of Israel that came up against the man of the Lord, against the hopeful elect, on the highways and byways or on the YouTube, whatever it may be. Then they're going to know that a prophet was among them. Then they're going to know what Yahweh Bashem Yahushua was saying through his mouthpiece, the prophets, was true. All the destruction, all the Jacob's trouble, the martial law, whatever it may be. Then they're gonna know, damn, it was true. What they were saying this whole time on the highways and byways and on the YouTube, it was true. Calling us bums, whatever it may be, broke, crazy, get a job. Verse 4, we fools accounted his life madness and his end to be without honor. Verse 5, how is he numbered among the children of Yahweh Bashem Yahushua, and his lot is among the saints. That's right. That's what's going to come across your mind. We thought of these, people on the highways and byways, with dresses on or whatever they may call it, on the YouTube, different social media sites, all the Hebrew Israelites, the black Hebrew Israelites. Then they're going to know what the man of the Lord was saying was true. How are they the ones who are part of the elect? How are they the ones that are getting beamed up? What they were saying sounded crazy. But it's not going to sound so crazy when everything that the men of the Lord was speaking and prophesying about comes to pass. Then they're going to completely bug out. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27. But Yahweh Bashim Yahushua had chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And that's right, the preaching on the highways and byways, prophesying, putting up these electronic epistles on the YouTube and the different internet sites. It looks foolish to these people. They might stumble upon a GMS video and click on it, and then they brush it off. What these people are saying is too crazy. There's going to be missiles hitting America. There's going to be Jacob's trouble. There's going to be famines and plagues, cannibalism. That all sounds crazy to the average 2/3 Israelite and these heathens. But ultimately it's meant to confound them, because unto the elect is going to be playing up on tables for them to understand that all these things are about to play out. They can see what's going around the world. And Yahweh Bashim Yahushua had chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. That's right. All these, or better say, the preaching, putting up these videos on the YouTube, and what we're saying and how we're breaking down the scriptures, it sounds foolish to the 2/3 of the nation of Israel that were blinded by Yahweh Bashim Yahushua and these heathens. They believe what they've been taught in these different churches, these other Israelite camps, and these colleges and universities. They think that that's what is true. Esau, Edom, pseudoscience. That the earth is billions of years old. That's what they believe. But we know that ultimately that's all false. That all those doctrines being taught in these schools and these universities, these theological schools, is all false. Only the true knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of Yahweh Bashim Yahushua is going to stand the test of time. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 19. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. And that's what's been going on ever since the late 60s, when the elder high priest Abba Bivens came to the scene. That's when the dry bones were both woken back up, put back together, and that breath was put in them, into the elders of our apostles and elders, and to this day, we're still prophesying the destruction of America, the MOTB. But 20 years ago, it sounded crazy, that America was going to collapse, that it was going to transfer to a digital system. Back then, all the using of credit cards and phones, that was a crazy thing back then. But how much more now? Now these things are starting to pass. Everything that these people claim to believe is falling. It's all coming to the fact that it's a lie. Verse 20, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Had not Yahweh Bashim Yahushua made foolish the wisdom of this world? And that's right. Yahweh Bashim Yahushua is ultimately making the wisdom of this world, the so-called wisdom, the knowledge, of these different colleges and universities, what they're teaching in these Christian churches. He's confounding it, ultimately, because what they're saying, now people are starting to wake up to the fact that it's not true. But still, the non-elect aren't going to come out of that. They're going to stay there until they get destroyed, till those missiles hit. Verse 21, for after that is the wisdom of Yahweh Bashim Yahushua. Or Salakia, verse 21, for after that in the wisdom of Yahweh Bashim Yahushua, the world by wisdom knew not Yahweh Bashim Yahushua. Yeah, and that's right. All these people that got all this so-called knowledge, they have went to these different colleges, universities, Harvard, Yale, MIT, whatever it may be. Ultimately, Yahweh Bashim Yahushua is confounding that wisdom that they so-called know, that they so-called learned. Because ultimately all those people, they don't know Yahweh Bashim Yahushua. The 2/3 of Jake, they're in these different prestige universities, these Ivy League schools, they don't know Yahweh Bashim Yahushua. Even though they paid all these hundreds of thousands of dollars to so-called get that knowledge and learn. Yahweh Shemiah Shai is not with those universities and colleges. It pleased Yahweh Shemiah Shai about the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. That's right. When we're out there on the highways and byways, prophesying the destruction of America, telling our people to repent to Yahweh Shemiah Shai and to get right while the doors of mercy are still open. That sounds foolish. Just like back in the time of Noah, it sounded foolish to the sons of God, that it was going to rain and there was going to be a flood. It's the same thing going on today. It sounds foolish. Ultimately, it's meant to sound foolish to the ones that don't believe, and to the ones that are going to believe, which are going to be the elect. It's going to make sense. It's going to click. But ultimately, majority of our people, the 2/3, and these damn heathens out here, they don't believe that what we're saying is true. But guess what? The wicked elite, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, those people up there that you don't see in the public, they believe that Yahweh Shemiah Shai exists. They believe that all these different prophecies are going to come to pass and that they're coming to pass. But our people don't believe because how we look. We look just like them. Just like in the time of Yahweh Shai, when he was on the scene, they pretty much came up to him and said, "Aren't you the carpenter's son?" And that's how they look at us. They look at us like, "Oh, you came from the same hood I grew up in. You came from the same high school I came in. I grew up with you. How are you now a prophet of Yahweh Shemiah Shai?" Just like Yahweh Shai came from Nazareth. The so-called hood back in the time of the ancient world in Jerusalem. Israel, that was the so-called hood of that time. It's the same thing today. A lot of different brothers come from different backgrounds. Some brothers might have grew up in rougher neighborhoods. Some brothers might have been a little better well off. But ultimately we all come from different backgrounds. But still, Jake ain't gonna believe. Because we so-called look just like them. Telling them to repent. In their minds, they think, "Oh, how are you better than me?" This is Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 15. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city, yet no man remembered that same poor man. Verse 16, then said I, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. That's right. Ultimately, our people, the 2/3, they don't hear our words because it comes from us, because it comes from somebody that looks just like them. So-called Negro, so-called Latino, so-called Native American. Ultimately, that's why they despise the words of the prophets, because in their minds, they think that, it's coming from them. It can't be true. But if it was to come from, a so-called white man in a suit, or a Christian bald-ass pastor in a suit, then they would believe. But ultimately, because it comes out of a man that so-called look like them, they don't believe. But ultimately, that's that stumbling block. It's supposed to look foolish, because Yahweh Shemiah Shai chose the lowly, the meek, out of this world. Not no high esteemed person in this society, a celebrity that's making billions, or a Christian pastor with a mega church, or somebody that went to college for 20 years. No, Yahweh Shemiah Shai is going to choose the least likely, the ones that seem like that is least likely to get it. Just like in the time of David, nobody expected David to be king. Jesse, showed all the different brothers that were, taller, buffer, whatever it may be. Ultimately, he chose David, and that's how it is today. It's supposed to look foolish to the ones that don't believe. This is Romans chapter 11, verse 7. What then? Israel had not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election had obtained it, and the rest were blinded. And that's right. Only the elect of the nation of Israel on this side are going to get it. Ultimately, because they look past how a brother looks, how tall he is, if his hairline's pushed back, if his beard's patchy, if he has a stutter in his speech, whatever it may be, they look past that, and they come to listen to what the men of Yahweh Bashim Yahushua are saying. They're listening to the words, they're listening to the prophecies, and they're taking heed. But the rest of the nation of Israel, the 2/3, and these heathens out here, they're not gonna listen to the man of Yahweh Bashim Yahushua, because they look at the preaching, they look at the videos, they look at the doctrine as foolish, But that's pretty much the point. I pray this is edifying to the elect. I want to give all praises, honor, glory to Yahweh, Bahashem Yahushai, Bahashem Kakodash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, who all learned this truth from the well. Peace and salutations to the 144,000 and the rest of the 1/3, the large multitude. Unto